Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. Of late, I've been doing an ongoing series where I review several different 1/72nd scale FW190s, and in today's video we'll be starting a build of one such kits we've looked at, the Tamiya 1/72nd scale FW190 A-3. So without further ado, let's start building this one and see if it lives up to Tamiya's reputation of being the kind of kit you can take off the shelf and shake and bake. As always, I give all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or grime from the sprues, and once they're all dry, I cut out the fuselage halves, instrument panel sections of sprue, the engine tub and gearbox, cockpit side panels, wing upper halves, wheel wells, cockpit tub, rear canopy area, the joystick, and the lower wings. Any excess plastic on these parts are cleaned up using a knife, and then I use some Revell Contactor Professional to assemble various sub-assemblies for painting. For my first sub-assembly, I glue the wheel well details to the upper wing halves, and then set those aside to dry. Next I assembled the two side panel details to the cockpit tub along with the seat and joystick, and attached the rear cockpit canopy sliding area to the left fuselage. The last assembly I added was the engine, which consisted of a polycap stuck into the gearbox, which was then glued into the engine tub. All of the parts in this kit seemed to fit really well together and had some pretty nice details. I then mixed together 2 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 2 drops of acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of a black primer into my airbrush, and sprayed the upper and lower wing sections, the 2 fuselage halves, cockpit assembly, engine assembly, and the instrument panel, which I'd left attached to some sprue to use as a handle. I do a few light passes on all of these parts, and then left the primer aside for a few hours to fully cure. Next I applied a thin coat of Vallejo Model Color Flat White to create some pre-shaded highlights on the various parts. In a few spots I got a little bit too close and applied the paint too fast, which caused a bit of spider webbing, but for the most part this step went without any issues. The wheel well was then sprayed a coat of Vallejo Model Air RLM02, although I applied it too quickly and lightly, causing unintentionally saturated and faded appearance, though I decided to experiment and leave it looking that way and see how it looked after some weathering. For the cockpit area and instrument panels, I sprayed them a few light passes of Vallejo Model Air RLM66 until the colour was nice and uniform. The engine assembly was then sprayed with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, and once that was applied, I set aside my airbrush for the moment and used a brush to apply several coats of the Model Air RLM02 on the upper wing interior parts, and for the inside walls of the engine cowling. To paint the raised cockpit and wheel well details, I first used some Vallejo Model Color Yellow to pick out the base of the throttle, and then I used a dry brushing technique to dab it onto some of the sidewall switches. The same technique was then used to apply some vermilion red onto the sidewalls. Decals are included for the instrument panel, but I decided to try painting it instead by hand, starting with some red and yellow for the switches and the border of some of the dials. I then used some Vallejo Model Color Flat Black to paint the top of the control stick, and then dabbed away the excess and once again dry brushed it lightly onto some of the switches and panels on the walls. For the oxygen dial, I applied a tiny dot of Vallejo Model Air RLM23 Blue on the instrument panel as a base, and once the RLM02 was dry, I painted the engine gearbox with flat black in several layers, along with the cannon details in the wheel well, before carefully painting the recessed dials on the instrument panel with the flat black. Model Color Flat White was used for both the side panels, and once the black had dried, was dry brushed over the instrument panel to add detail to all of the gauges. On some of the dials, I also dabbed it a little bit in the middle. After the cannons received a few more coats of the black, the barrels were painted with Vallejo Model Air gunmetal, and for the seat cushion, I painted it a base coat of Vallejo Model Color US Field Drab, and while it dried, I dry brushed some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium along the edges of the seat, the cockpit floor, raised panels on the sidewalls, and the raised details in the wheel well to create some metal chipping on the exposed raised edges. I then got out some Vallejo Model Color Buff and dry brushed the seat cushion to give it a heavily faded leather look. After a bit more metal chipping, I then glued the upper and lower wing halves together and gave the cockpit tub, sidewalls and engine a coat of Tamiya black panel accent to give them some grime, create some shading, and help to highlight details. On the wheel wells, I decided to further experiment with some dark brown panel wash instead of black, since it was a lighter colour and to give it more of a dirty appearance. Once the panel liner had dried, I then used a brush or cotton bud soaked in enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner from raised areas, making the effect less dark, and helping the panel liner to flow more into just the gaps, making the details pop. Although I wasn't going to use the instrument dial decals in the kit, I decided to use the included seatbelt ones. I cut them out, stuck them in some warm water, and while waiting for them to come loose of the transfer paper, I carefully dabbed some Vallejo gloss varnish onto all of the dials to give them a shiny glass-like appearance. The seatbelt decal was then slid onto the seat, where it nicely conformed to the shape, and was given a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive to help it stick down. With all of the interior work now done, the instrument panel was finally cut out of the sprue and glued to the cockpit tub, and then I glued the two fuselage halves together, clamped them with a bulldog clip, and added the engine tub and cockpit tub. By now the wing halves had fully bonded, so I glued them to the underside of the fuselage halve and held them in place. I found the fit of all the parts was exceptional, and there were very few gaps on this model, definitely a lot less than on the Airfix kit. The upper cowling part, landing gear covers and horizontal stabilizers were then cut out, cleaned of any seam lines and excess sprue with a file, and then attached to the model. I didn't glue the landing gear doors into place however, so that I could both use them as a mask for the wheel well, while also painting them with the fuselage, and when done I would glue them in the open position. The model was now ready for some Vallejo water-based putty to fill in the very few gaps that existed between the fuselage halves, the wing root and fuselage joint, and a few light spots on the wing and engine cowling. Once the putty had been applied, I used a damp finger to wipe away the excess so that it would only remain in the recessed gaps. Once dry, I then sanded away any remaining putty and seam lines, and any lost panel lines were then carefully rescored with a Tamiya scribing tool. The sanding process leaves a fair bit of dust, so I blew this off using my airbrush, and once the engine and cockpit had been masked with some white tack, I began to apply some Vallejo gloss black primer over the entire exterior. I aimed to apply the primer gradually by spraying it in several quick passes, moving the model around and then repeating the process until the entire upper surface had a good uniform and gloss black finish. I initially tried holding onto the model using the white tack areas on the fuselage, but found it stuck to my gloves too much. Though I found a cocktail stick was very useful for holding the model down while spraying the upper surface. Once the upper surface had been painted, I then let the primer harden for a couple of hours, before then turning the model over and repeating the process, applying the primer to the underside of the aircraft, until the model had a nice gloss black finish that was ready to receive some paint. Thank you very much for watching this video, and a special thank you to all of my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund buying these kits and the products I use to make them. Feel free to leave any questions or any friendly suggestions on how I can improve my model making in the comments below, and if you like this one and want to help support me making more inbox reviews, build videos and stop motions, please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and consider joining my Patreon where you'll get some nice little perks. Part 2 should be coming out around about a week after I've released this one, so stay tuned for that where we'll be covering painting. Otherwise though, until the next video, take care and
shake and bake.